I'm out in our main garden this morning doing some work in the theme of lifting and dividing, in this particular case, a patch of cultivar female seaberry plants. Sea buckthorn is another name for them. And I thought I would share in this video the process that I go through in being able to lift and divide some pretty significantly large woody perennials and what that flow looks like, so stick around. They tend to have really thick, robust root systems that are relatively shallow. And so what I find is that I can use the King of Spades. This is a tool I talked about pretty extensively in another video. I'll link to that here. And I'm excavating these clumps to pretty significantly large plants. And we're gonna move all of these up to our larger site. They've been in the garden here for, I think, 4 years. And we don't need such dense, spiky, intense shrub layer in the middle of the garden. Seaberry is great on the edges. We're learning that over time. And so I'm going to dig these up and talk about healing them in and what transport would look like to get them to our larger 6-acre site. You can see I've got 3 large clumps here right now. And for the sake of ease for transporting, I'm not going to try to bare root these. We're not shipping them. So the more soil I leave on when I bring these up to our other site, the easier they'll be to get established. I can plug these in and really pack soil around. And the process that I've used for that, I basically chip away at the colony from the outside in. And you can see what I've been doing is taking the shovel, digging some soil away from near where these plants are, revealing the roots, basically almost creating like a vertical soil profile, an island around each of the sets of plants. And then here's one section I'll divide out. I'm going to use this spade, this is one of the main reasons why it's so amazing. It's very sharp. And so I can push through with one cut and pry a little. And because I excavated the soil away from the sides, this comes out as a really nice nugget. That's a good 4-foot tall plant. Let's go for something a little bit more challenging. So I'm going to dig through here, set the shovel, and then I stomp and spread it a little. I would probably describe digging seaberry of this size as one of the most challenging parts of the nursery, in part because the roots are so strong, but also they're just filled with hypodermic needles right at eye height, so I squint. But you can see it even with a thick root like that, it's able to cut through, and then the rest are thin enough that I can do it without my foot. And then I'll slice that through, grab low on the plant and pry, and that will let me get another nugget out. Last but not least, the last one should be the easiest because I'm not cutting it away from others. These have stinging nettles growing around them. We're gonna leave that. I feel like stinging nettle and seaberry would be a neat guild in a new context. That is a pile of plants. These clumps will now be brought over to a nice sheltered spot in the backyard where I can heal them in with a whole bunch of sawdust and old leaves. And then in part 2 with this, I'll talk about how we wrap these plants and get them on the truck to transport them up to the larger landscape and what it looks like to plant those in. But let's look at an example here of moving really large woody shrubs into a landscape. We did this a couple of years ago from here over to our neighbors, and let's take a look at that. We'll head out through the gate. Very, very crusty this morning. It's kind of a perfect day for doing this kind of work because it's physically very vigorous. There's a little bit of ice, but as soon as you get below, you can get into soft soil. And so it's a really good day for moving plants and doing transplanting. We talked about in a past video, which I will link to here, what it looked like to establish this seaberry orchard in our neighbor's spot. So we're just about 10 yards to the south of where I was just digging. And it was the same female cultivar plants. We did this in, I believe, 2020. And in 2 years, they were able to establish incredibly well. In fact, they're starting to form suckers, which we can dig up and transplant. And this block of females that we moved at a similar size to what we were just looking at in the garden produced at least 2 or 3 gallons of fruit this year. So as long as we get a really good male in association with the new ones we just dug up and we plant them out, there'll be about twice as many as there were here. In 2 years, they'll be up to absolute full peak production. It's pretty stunning. The other great thing about this plant is you can see how once they're established, they are very great at keeping up with competition. We don't really weed much in here. I weed whack once in a while, but they're just sending up suckers all over. And that's such an easy pathway to propagate more plants. We can dig these up and pot them in the spring. In fact, this is just about ideal right here. Each one of these shoots is a rooted, named cultivar seaberry female. So in 2 years, not only did they get themselves established and crop pretty assertively, some pretty wonderful, amazing medicine fruit, delicious stuff, they also suckered enough that we'll be able to probably get 50 to 100 little suckers for division and local sale in the spring. This is a pretty awesome plant. Got a couple more to bring over and heal in. It's a pretty wonderful amount of free plants just from digging up an excess spot in the garden. Good reminder here, if you are moving seaberry or working with seaberry, let's see if it'll even wear gloves. It's hard to convey the actual yield from just a few square feet of nursery space dedicated to a suckering woody perennial for 4 years. But you can imagine there's a fair bit of planting material in here. There's at least 10 extremely well-rooted 6 to 7 foot tall or taller female seaberry at ready for crop production next year. So if we get them established this winter, they should be able to have enough feeder roots to flower and mature a serious crop next season. Out in the garden, we are left with a mess. There's a fair bit to clean up. But what's happened that is very helpful is we've reclaimed some bed space that can be returned to more intimate crop production, either nursery plants from seed or annuals grown out. It's basically a crater here right now. And what I think I'm realizing is this whole area, this walkway, was extremely hard to get through in the past because there's seaberry on one side, seaberry on the other, and it's a very wet trench. Maybe there's an opportunity here to actually dig this out and say, okay, it wants to be a wet area, let's get way, way wetter. And then we've got all this soil that can migrate into these other garden beds that have gotten lost to herbaceous perennial weeds. Just bury them in a foot of rich muck soil and get a pond out of the context. So from a seaberry patch to a micro pond, maybe the next step in the transition. We'll share notes when we get to that part. And I plan to do a follow-up video where we take all those plants that have been healed in and establish them in our larger landscape and talk about that process. So keep an eye out for that video too. Thanks for watching.